and music and sound.
Hello, and welcome to Cahnmann's Current Events Roundtable. Today we have an exciting program because it is so relevant of what's happening in our government today, transparency and open government. And today we have Dr. James Marquardt, who's the Associate Professor of Politics at Lake Forest College, where he chairs the International Relations Program. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Suzanne.
Shake your hand. I think we're going to still shake hands when we finish the program, aren't we?
Okay.
Okay. Jim holds a PhD in political science and an MA in international relations from the University of Chicago, and his publications include a book which is called Transparency, an American Primacy in World Politics. Most recently, he has co-authored 2 articles on U.S.-China relations, which will be published in early 2014, which will come back and we'll talk about U.S.-China relations and anything else that you will be publishing in between. And he is currently doing research for a manuscript on open government and transparency in the Obama administration. My God, that is a mouthful. And it's very, very relevant of what's happening now, because I would just like to read something that President Obama, the administration, that they printed out, which is called Transparency and Open Government. My administration is committed to creating an unprecedented level of openness in government. We will work together to ensure the public trust and establish a system of transparency, public participation, and collaboration. Openness will be strengthen our democracy and promote efficiency and effectiveness in government. So, since you published that article, so much has come out, Jim. So maybe you'd like to talk to a little bit of the viewers, and first of all, maybe so people will understand what is really openness, government, open government and transparency.
Yeah.
We hear these words all the time,
Sure.
And I'm not quite sure if I personally understand them. I don't
Sure.
know what's open, what's transparent. There's so much that's going on, like happened just recently with Mr. Snowden, et cetera, Mr. Manning, Mr. Assange, and all these things that are happening. So I'm not quite sure what is open government and what is transparency.
Sure.
So maybe
Sure,
we'll
let's
let you
start
take
there.
about that.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, open government is a doctrine. It's a political doctrine. And generally, it's saying that the government should be committed to ensuring that the people have access to government information through documents, through access to proceedings of government. And it's based on the idea that government in a democratic society requires that the people who are the sovereign, the people themselves, have certain rights. And to exercise those rights and to protect their liberties, they have to have access to government information. And government, therefore, has an obligation to provide that information. So we can call that generally open government or openness.
But how much openness, if you're open, it's good. People want to know what their government is doing, and it's good to hear what our government is doing. But so does our enemies. So whatever we tell the people, we are also telling our enemies. So how much openness should government be doing, and how, when Snowden thought he was doing us a favor and telling everybody what exactly all the things that we're hiding and what we're doing, we're listening to people's phone calls and listening to people's everything else in their mail, their email, and everything else. What exactly should be open and what should not be open?
Sure. Well, this has been a big debate, and the openness movement, if you want to call it, is something that really goes back to the founding of the Republic. I mean, it's very kind of fundamental to this idea of democracy and self-government. The notion of how much the people should know requires a balance, right? Because in a democratic society like ours, we want to have access to government information because, again, we are the sovereigns, right? The government works for us.
Okay.
We don't work for them. So therefore, there's a presumption that the people have a right to this. Interestingly enough, however, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that explicitly mandates that the people shall have access to information. This is generally a norm that is out there, but it's not codified in the Constitution. On the flip side of that, of course, is that every country, whether it's a democracy or a non-democracy, doesn't really matter, has certain secrets that it wants to keep. And some governments keep secrets because they're afraid of their own people. Some governments have secrets because they're trying to protect their people for security purposes. In our country, generally the historical record has been that a certain degree of secrecy is required for the general welfare and the security of the people. And where we draw that line between the two, this kind of expectation of openness and this requirement of secrecy, is really a political battle that plays itself out in the country historically over time. So if I could just spend like a few minutes talking about that general history and the general idea of open government and its relationship to transparency.
Okay, because I don't think our viewers or I think we're all kind of wondering what is this open government and how it started and why people believe that they should have access or whatever to all the information that may hurt us as far as our security.
Sure.
Because that's something that can be a little bit scary too.
Sure. So the idea of openness is really something that in the Western tradition begins as part of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was a movement that began in the 17th, 18th century, which says that there is this kind of explosion in knowledge and inquiry that we can use kind of scientific methods to discover the world around us. We can advance science, we can advance understanding, we can improve the world, make the world a better place. And as part of that movement of the Enlightenment, there are philosophers in Britain and also in France who were talking about the importance of enlightenment leading to government that had legitimacy in the eyes of the people. So there was a sense that for government to be really helping the people, improving society, being a force for improvement and progress, that it had to be democratic, it had to be held accountable by the people, and that the people had this kind of inherent right to know what the government was doing. Moreover, the people had a right to a voice. They had the right to kind of petition the government, to debate major issues, both in private and in public, to engage their elected representatives. So this is really the origins of open government. And in the British tradition, probably the most important thinker who was very influential to the early American leaders of the Republic was a guy named Jeremy Bentham. And he argued that open government is necessary to protect the people from malfeasance on the part of government officials. So for him, transparency was a form of the people conducting surveillance over the government, right? And so nowadays, because of these national security concerns,
right,
it's been kind of flipped around a bit, right? So now government is conducting surveillance of the people, right? And so that's kind of been turned on its head. But at least originally, in the Enlightenment period, in the way that Bentham thought of it,
so it was kind of watching what our politicians
absolutely.
did. It was kind of a watchful
Everyone
eye.
with power needs to be under surveillance, right? And for Bentham, it was the people's surveillance of the government.
I see.
Now, the idea of transparency is a word that comes from the French, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others who were talking about this idea of clarity, this idea of understanding. And in politics, we kind of generally use that as a way to get at the idea that people have access to information. Now, we know that, transparency is an ideal, right? It doesn't exist in reality in a perfect form. There's always some degree of uncertainty. There's always some degree of opacity. But I think the Enlightenment notion was that we could progress towards an increasingly transparent society in which the people would understand, they would know, things would be clear to them in terms of what the government was doing. And that's the kind of relationship between the two concepts.
That's how it started.
Yes.
But now with all the nuclear and all the terrorist attacks, and they didn't have that in those days.
Sure.
I mean, there's a big concern for the people's safety and security. And, recently we've had some real characters, and I call them characters because we've never had anything like this before. And I believe it started with Mr. Assange, Julian Assange from the WikiLeaks. And then we had Mr. Manning.
Yes.
And now we have Mr. Snowden.
Yes.
And what exactly, I quoted an article by Richard Haas, who was the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, said, and apparently these people call themselves a whistleblower. And he says a whistleblower is a person who reveals wrongdoings, corruption, illegal activity. And it appears to be that none of this applies here, even if you oppose the U.S. government policy. So maybe you could tell our viewers the difference between a whistleblower and a informer and a spy.
Sure.
And we also forgot Jonathan Pollard, who also, for what he did, he has been sitting in a jail for, I think he had, I'm not quite sure what he did, and no one else is sure what he did, because he did something about secrets giving to Israel, who's our ally, and not too much has come out of what happened, but he's been sitting in prison for
over 20 years.
Over 20 years. Yeah. Now, what is the difference between what he did and what Mr. Manning did, what Mr. Assange did, and what Mr. Snowden?
Sure.
Give us some ideas of and this whistleblower.
Sure. So let me kind of differentiate terms that are related to this idea of open government and surveillance.
Okay.
So different terms are kind of thrown about, and you mentioned a couple of them. So we can differentiate classifications. So one would be a spy. Right? A spy would be someone who is collecting information and maybe for profit, maybe for ideology, is providing that information to a foreign government.
There was like the Rosenbergs.
Yes, or an agent of a foreign government. That would be a spy.
I remember the Rosenbergs, they not only went to trial, but they were executed for it.
They were. That was quite a sensational series of events as well.
That was down in was that in the 50s or 60s?
I believe it was in the early Cold War period, so it would have been the late 40s, early 50s.
50s, right. Because I remember I was very little. Very little.
So,
and I remember it on radio, by the way.
So according to the government, people like Mr. Pollard and others, they're spies. They have access to government information. They're collecting that information. They are stealing that information, and they're giving it to someone else. Again, they could be doing it for profit, or they could be doing it for strong convictions. So that will be a spy. Another.
Could that be Mr. Snowden? Because Manning stayed here.
Yes.
Okay, and he's court-martialed. Where Snowden has gone from Hong Kong to Russia, and now he's going to Ecuador.
Well, that's where he would like to go.
That's where he's Well, that's where the WikiLink is trying to cooperate and trying to get him to. Julian Assange and his group are trying to get him to Ecuador.
Well, Mr. Snowden would not be classified as a spy
yet,
because he's apparently not handing over information specifically to a foreign government or a foreign agent.
But how do we know that?
Well, so far we don't.
Yeah.
But at least based upon what we do know from his own statements in interviews that he has had since these revelations, he would classify himself as a whistleblower, someone who is trying to draw public attention to a series of activities conducted by the government in secret that he believes are a problem. Maybe he believes they violate the Constitution. Maybe he believes they are trampling the rights and liberties of the people. He's getting that information out there. He's publicizing information for the purpose of drawing the people into a national debate and hopefully compelling politicians to change the policies that he believes are kind of counterproductive.
Yeah, but Jim, I see your point, and I think you're right about that. But if he would have stayed here and he did exactly what you said, I agree. But because he went to a country like, say, China, Hong Kong, China, who are not quite they're questionable allies, and who have been spying on us, by the way. China's done a lot of spying. Then he went to Russia, and we know that Russia always spies on us. Why he just didn't stay here and get his point across? Then I would agree 100%. He's an idealist, and he feels the government is not, in the beginning you talked about transparency and open government, and he feels that people should know what's happening. But for him to go over to our enemy's territory, we don't know what he's collected. It's according to Dianne Feinstein and Representative Peter King, he said he knows where our intelligent assets are, who our intelligent agents are around the world, and the fact that he has allowed our enemy to know what our sources and methods are and is extremely, extremely dangerous. I believe he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And that was Representative King, who is Republican, and Dianne Feinstein says very much the same thing. So I agree with your first statement, but the second part of it, since he knows so much, and why would he go to our enemies, cross over? That's where it bothers me.
Yeah, sure. So one might argue that Snowden's credibility with the American people in revealing these secret actions by the government, where in effect they're collecting information about our personal communications, that the best thing he could have done to get that point across is to hold a press conference,
Yes.
let's say across from the White House in Lafayette Park, right? So one would assume if he were to do that, within a day or so, perhaps less, he would have been arrested and indicted, right? Because apparently, the way the government sees it, he is violating laws that have been debated and passed by Congress, signed by the president, which establish certain limitations on what kind of information the people have a right to know for purposes of national security. However, again, he could have done that. So what he did do was he left the country.
Or he could have gone on all the talk shows.
He could have gone on all the talk shows.
George Stephanopoulos and
That would have been
Gregory.
a very dramatic way of
Yeah.
doing it. But he would have faced the certainty of arrest. Now, what he did instead was, he went to a foreign jurisdiction, and he then provided interviews to the press based on articles that were published first in the Guardian newspaper of Britain several weeks ago. And initially, it was a very dramatic disclosure, but then his kind of globe trekking,
Yes, that's
especially
what
to
bothered
countries that are not America's friends, kind of begins to undermine his credibility. Who is he? Who are his friends? Who is he serving? What information may he have revealed? Could he be not only a whistleblower based upon what he would think of himself, but could he be a spy? Could he have provided these governments with information that we don't know about? I think the U.S. government might have a reason to believe that is the case. But according to Snowden and his supporters at WikiLeaks, including Mr. Assange, they see themselves as whistleblowers. The government sees them as leakers and potentially as spies.
I see.
And then there's one other term that's worth talking about briefly in the open government transparency debate, and that is watchdogs. A watchdog would be an individual or a group, a civil society group outside of government that is collecting information, doing investigations, and revealing that information to the public. So, for example, the press. The Constitution provides for freedom of the press, right? The press is a classic watchdog organization. They're reporting about malfeasance, about activities that are going on. They have their sources. They keep their sources private. The Constitution protects those sources. However,
That's why, remember, and they were investigating them too.
that's right, that's right. But then when the press, in its role as the watchdog, is now revealing sensitive information that falls under the veil of secrecy for reasons of national security, then the constitutional protections for the watchdogs and their sources begin to crumble, which is why we now have these controversies about journalists being arrested or put on trial.
Or going into their telephone records
Yes.
and listening into their phone calls.
That's right. That's
so,
right.
because journalists want to, feel free. So if they have somebody that wants to tell them something, they want to protect that person.
Absolutely, because protecting your sources is really important to building a relationship with them, to getting the information that you need, and they're not going to reveal information to you
If they know they're being taped and
That's
they're
right.
being watched.
That's right.
Exactly.
Let me just read to you. You had read a few minutes ago one of the statements by the Obama administration
Right.
on open government.
And we have still a few minutes left
Sure.
that we could
Let me
do it.
look at the opposite end of that.
Okay.
Namely, in the Obama administration's efforts to provide for open government, namely to advance freedom of information, to require agencies to disclose information more quickly, to provide lots of data on the internet that people can access regarding taxes and all kinds of other spending issues. Here are the limitations on open government that are established in the Obama administration's program. And I'll quote from their
Okay.
most recent report from last year. The report reads as follows: open government is not unqualified or unconditional. While making government more open has been and remains a high priority of the administration, that priority does not trump all other concerns. No supporter of open government would characterize it as disclosure of everything all of the time, no matter the consequences. This all seems very reasonable, right? But then we have this language which suggests a slippery slope. It goes on to say, thus, the administration's pursuit of open government has been and must be balanced against other important considerations. Among them are national security, the needs of law enforcement officials, government privileges, and the protection of personal privacy and business confidentiality, and more importantly, to encourage robust and candid deliberations among government officials who have to make public policy. Now, I would argue that that statement is generally eloquent and reasonable, but then we have this concern is what is the proper balance? Who decides what that proper balance is?
Right.
When do we invoke that balance? Do the people know what that balance might be? That's where the problems lie.
And I think that's what needs to be explained. I don't think our president or the administration or the previous administration, no one explains that to the people. They feel that the people should know everything, but nobody really explains what. It's okay. We should know things, but there are times when we shouldn't know everything. Because if we know things, our enemies
That's
will know
right.
everything. And so I think this needs to be explained, and no one seems to get up and talk about it.
Yes.
I think the people need to know this.
Yes.
As far as going into what are your feelings about the government going into the people's listening into the phone calls, and what are your feelings
Sure,
about that?
Sure. Well, the one thing that Snowden did do, which he deserves credit for, he's opened to big debate. And he's also prompted the government officials in the Obama administration to say to the American people, we want to tell you more about these surveillance programs. We don't want to be thinking that we are spying on you just for the purpose of spying, right? There's a purpose to this. We want to explain this to you. We need a process that allows us to declassify certain information so we can educate the American people. That's all well and good.
That is good.
But the extent to which the government is collecting information is troublesome. Precisely what it's doing, it's hard to define. I mean, different analysts have different explanations as to what's going on. Is it aggregate data? Is it data mining? Is it eavesdropping on your phone conversations and mine, tracking our email?
Or is it trying to, maybe your Middle East, who you're talking to the Middle East, who you're doing business with? I mean, it may be not listening in, but it may be just trying to find out where these phone calls are coming from. Because, there's so many, the bombers, look what happened in Boston. I mean, they were able to track down some of these because of that.
Now, the administration also argues, and I think the president suggested this, well, he explicitly mentioned it, that these programs that are going on, this data mining programs.
Explain what data mining is.
Yeah,
people don't know what data mining is.
It's looking at kind of aggregate information, not kind of listening to specific information, but looking at the flow of connections of communications. And based on mathematical algorithms, the government can look at patterns. And once they've identified patterns, they can break those patterns down and try to sort out who is calling who's in contact with who, and try to figure out, are these potential relationships that are worthy of further scrutiny?
Like if I'm calling Syria, if I'm calling Jordan, if I'm calling these countries, maybe a one-time thing, maybe I know somebody there, but, a pattern of what's going on. That's very important. And, it also bothers me of how these men, we have 2 minutes, oh my goodness, how are we going to do this in 2 minutes? But the people that are being vetted, are they not being vetted? How does a man, Snowden, 30-year-old man who just got his GED not long ago, his high school, and he's making $200,000 and Manning, how do these people that have low, they're not in a, except for Jonathan Pollard, you said was he was going for his PhD, but how do these people get into the system? How do they get employed in such delicate information? Well, it's very shocking.
You would think that in the post-9/11 world, where we have all these new security concerns, that the government would be particularly careful about who gets top security clearances. But in fact, the opposite has unfolded. Namely, we have the emergence of these intelligence for-profit corporations that are now selling their services to the government. So we are in effect handing over aspects of our state secrecy to private corporations. And of course, Mr. Snowden was employed by one of these for-profit private corporations.
And see, people don't know that. They thought he was, from the government, but he's apparently, he was privatized.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
But he was given clearance, though.
Yeah, he was given clearance.
At the same time.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
People go to school, and I know you have a PhD, and you know how long it took you to get that PhD. Too long, right? And here's somebody that just gets $200,000, and not even, it has very little degree. But as you said, he's very high tech. He's a good techie.
Yes.
So listen, I want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Invite you back on the show when you finish your book or your next book, and bring it with you, because we want to show it. And I'd love for you to come out and talk more about what's really going on in politics, because I think it's so important to hear from the expert on what these things are about, and not just pick up a newspaper and what everybody else is saying. But we really have an expert on the show, James Marquardt, who is associate producer at Lake Forest College, Lake Forest, Illinois. I'm so happy to have him on, and I hope that each of you, maybe any questions, contact him or contact the station.
Sure.
Thank you very much, and again, thank you for coming on their show.